Hello and welcome to everybody. My name's Claire de Castella and I'm the Business Manager for the Climate Change Institute. And we'd like to welcome you to the COVID-19 and Climate Change event series. Today, our speaker, Professor Mark Howden, will be talking about the parallels and disconnects between the virus and climate change. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're present today and to pay my respects to elders past and present. In my case, that's Ngunnawal land, but obviously we're spread all over Australia and perhaps the world. So just to start off with some housekeeping, this event is scheduled to go for 45 minutes. Our speaker will talk for about 20 minutes and this will be followed by audience Q&A. You can ask your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can also vote on which questions you'd like answered by pressing the thumbs up as part of that. Please don't put your questions into the chat function as they won't be included in the Q&A. And it's also a moderated Q&A, which is designed for questions, not for commentary. So any comments in the Q&A will be deleted. And now I'll introduce Professor Mark Howden. He is the Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. He's one of Australia's leading climate scientists and a Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's worked on climate variability, climate change, and innovation issues for over 30 years. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Claire. And what I'm trying to do here today is just give a very sort of quick overview of what is emerging as a very complex area. And this is a lead into a series of 4 at the moment sort of coverages of this combination of learning from coronavirus and its application to climate change. So the next one is on policy responses, then there's one on communications, and then there's one on health. So today what I'm trying to do is give a bit of an overview of very much a personal perspective of the things that we've learnt from the coronavirus shutdown pandemic experience and how that may apply to climate change. So I'll just move into the presentation if I can, and then I'll load this up and then I think we can start. So Claire, just checking, can you see the full screen opening slide?
Yes, I can, yeah. Okay,
fantastic. Okay, so as I said today, I'm just giving a very quick overview of this very complex topic. So I'll race through a series of points here. But just to start with, I think it's really important to establish that there is actually a basis for comparison. So there is some similarity between the coronavirus experience and climate change, so that there is actually a basis for learning. And so a really quick list of these is on the screen here. So the similarities, both the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and climate change are effectively invisible. We only detect them through their effects on us. So we don't know if that door handle has a virus on it. We can't see it. Likewise, we don't see the emissions of carbon dioxide from the exhaust of our car. They both have lagged effects. So in the case of coronavirus, it's a couple of weeks, or maybe several days or a couple of weeks before you start to get sick. And so there's a risk of transmission in that time frame. Similarly, with climate change, we have a lagged effect between emissions and their effects in terms of climate changes. They both have an exponential nature, and that's been really critical in terms of climate, the coronavirus, as it has been in terms of climate change, and I'll explain that a bit later. Both of them have implications which range from personal to global. So they cover the whole spectrum of scale. They both have systemic impacts which require integrative responses. And both of them impact most on disadvantaged people. So in addition to some of these similarities, there are some differences, and I'll draw out a few of these as I go through the presentation. So one of the things that's very apparent in terms of the coronavirus experience is the response is very much hinged on immediacy and severity. because we assessed it as being an immediate and large threat, it generated immediate and large responses. And to put that into perspective, at the moment, coronavirus is responsible by itself for something like 3 deaths in every 1,000 across the globe. And I'll explain in a few slides why that may be an underestimate, but just keeping in mind it's that sort of scale of impact. And that's the sort of thing that we were concerned about, that excess of deaths, the human cost of coronavirus. But if we actually use the same sort of assessment, what we can see is that climate change is already causing a similar cost. So the World Health Organization assessments are that climate change right now directly is influencing about 3 deaths per 1,000. So it's the same sort of scale as coronavirus, but our response is very different. And if we include air pollution, and we can see from responses over the last couple of months how reduction in various activities reduces both greenhouse gas emissions and associated air pollution, that air pollution, again by itself, is responsible for something like 140 out of every 1,000 deaths across the globe. And that's without starting to think about the other costs that we're currently experiencing from climate change related activities and impacts. Things such as fire, smoke, heat, stress, floods, drought, and sea level rise, all of which have additional costs apart from those associated with the lives lost. And yet, we were prepared to respond radically and in a huge way to coronavirus, but we don't seem to apply the same logic to climate change, even though demonstrably they're of similar scale in terms of their current impacts, let alone the future impacts of climate change. We've also learned from coronavirus that early action is largely good action. The rapid responses that some countries have undertaken have reduced the damage, reduced the cost, reduced the duration of the pandemic in those countries, and increased the reversibility, the ability to manage the system. And in contrast, delayed responses damage and kill. And just to give you a small taste of that, the death rates in a few different countries. In Australia, we unfortunately have a death rate of 1 per person per every 250,000. Every death is an unfortunate matter. But in the US, it's 1 per 3,000 people. In the UK, it's 1 per 1,600 people. And we know that the UK and US responses were problematic, in particular in relation to the leadership or lack thereof. And this is the consequence of that. And you can see that there are massively different outcomes in terms of deaths per head of population. Now, of course, no early response, which is done in a hurry, is going to be perfect. But it's good enough just to get it roughly right. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to delay, but just get it roughly right. And it's the same for climate change. We know that we're heading towards our emissions budget very quickly that's consistent with staying below 1.5 degrees. We don't have to get a perfect response. We just have to get a good enough response to that. But we don't seem to be able to get over that hurdle. But the other thing we've learned from a coronavirus experience is that it's very difficult for a late response to be a good response. And we can see from this headline that just came out this morning that if the UK had locked down a week earlier, there's an estimate they could have halved the death rate in the UK. So every week matters. And so early action is good action. But even better is informed early action. So what we've seen with the coronavirus is to some extent a revival of the value of experts and expertise. The ability to have someone explaining the detail, a Norman Swan who can explain what's going on so that people actually feel involved in the decision making and prepared to actually take costs themselves. We also get comforted by the fact that dodgy sort of suggestions get slapped down and buried fairly quickly, simply because there's expertise on hand to demonstrate the problematic nature of those. But it has also raised the issue about choose your expert to get the answer you want. So it's the choice between a Norman Swan and a Brendan Murphy. in terms of things like, should schools stay open or should they stay closed? Should our borders open or should they close? And when do they open up? And experts, as demonstrably has happened, have come to very different conclusions, presumably based on the same information base. And what that does is it pushes the risk back, given the experts can't agree, it pushes the risk back into that political domain where sometimes problematic decisions can be made. And of course, there are fundamental political decisions, such as the scale of the lockdown response, the economic response, which go way beyond medical information, medical expertise, and the still emerging knowledge base around coronavirus. And exactly the same applies to climate change. We do have expertise, but there's a diversity of expertise, and there is often cherry picking of that expertise to get the answer that governments want, which is often to maintain the status quo. But I think sometimes people have got a little bit overexcited about the evidence-based element of decision making. So if we actually think about a continuum between evidence-free decision making and evidence-based decision making, in the sense of very strongly evidence-based, we can see that on one hand, there's concern about the political and subjective and biased and corrupt risks associated with decision making, which is evidence-free. But on the other hand, we should also be concerned if it's too heavily evidence-based on it becoming technocratic, unbalanced, clunky and slow. And there is a middle ground here, which is about evidence-informed judgments. And my own view is that that is the role of science. We are not elected decision makers to make those big calls on economic responses, but we can inform those calls made by politicians, our elected officials. And we actually can see that concern about some of these things happening with Ruby Princess, where I think most people would have said that was a dumb idea right at the time. And we're actually starting to delve into why it happened. And we're becoming dismayed at that decision-making process. And there is a really common ground. There is a place where the two Venn diagrams of judgment and evidence meet. And a classic example is in Germany with Angela Merkel, who actually has a science background, who can understand the science information, the research information, can ask sensible questions back of the research community. And as a result, not only have they made good decisions, but her popularity has soared. So there is actually a benefit to politicians from actually taking notice of the evidence. Now, we've also not stopped decision making. When there was those huge calls in terms of the economic response, that didn't stop us. And I would argue that we know much more about climate change, the trade-offs inherent in different responses, how much to in relation to climate change. So we know we can do it. We know we can actually make decisions in the face of uncertainty, but we choose some topics, we do that well, and others we don't. And we come to a point where the numbers matter when it comes to decision making. I just put this in because I love this slide. And who in their right mind would have actually put these two notices side by side? So at the small scale and at the big scale, numbers really matter. So in terms of numbers mattering, particularly I think they matter in relation to costs and lives. So usually when it comes to climate change, one of the key reasons why we don't commit to a net zero greenhouse gas target is something along the lines, we don't know how much it will cost. And of course, that's a very, very telling statement, because it treats climate change as only a cost item. It doesn't look at the benefit side of the equation. It doesn't look at this as an investment in our future, that some costs now can generate huge benefit later. And the scale of that is starting to come out in various analyses, such as Tom Compass's from University of Melbourne. But that lack of understanding about costs and the costs and benefits did not stop us from acting in terms of the pandemic. We still went ahead with the single biggest economic outlay in the history of Australia. And in terms of that outlay, the Frydenbungle, the $60 billion error term in the JobKeeper estimates, would almost be enough to transition us as a nation to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. There's a whole series of analyses which actually show that that's the sort of scale of funding which would be adequate to take us to net zero by 2050. I think that's a really telling thing. The error term in that decision was enough to take us to net zero if we applied that well. And of course, the numbers matter intensely when it comes to lives. And as we know, the coronavirus death toll is horrifying and it's growing. But the really concerning thing is that what we see as the numbers in the US, etc., could actually be a gross underestimate of the real death toll. So we only know about this, in a sense, in hindsight. So going beyond the official diagnosed sort of deaths, we need to look at what we call the all-death rate and the gap between what would normally happen in a given week or a given month versus what actually happened. And to give you an example of this, in the UK, in the week of the 3rd of April of this year, there were 3,475 deaths which were officially associated with coronavirus. So it's about 21% of the deaths that would normally be expected. But the all-cause deaths were about 6,000. So there's a big gap there, is that the number of deaths that are actually happening in this period grossly exceeds the normal death rate. And only part of that is officially associated with coronavirus diagnoses. Now, there's a whole range of reasons why we have that excess death rates, and some of it is people can't get medical care for the things that are going wrong with them because of the overload on medical systems and a range of things like that. But nevertheless, that excess death rate grossly exceeds the numbers that we're seeing in terms of diagnosed coronavirus deaths. And what that tells us is that the way we measure things really matters. And it's the same with climate change. The way we actually measure things, the way we communicate things can really distort the public discourse and really distort the information that's inserted into public debates. And if you have distorted information, you're also going to get distorted responses and decisions. And one example of that was came out just from ANU a week or two ago, which is Anna Greta Hunter and Simon Quilty's work, which actually shows that our death certificates in Australia don't include, for the most part, anything to do with heat-related causes of deaths. So we're going to grossly underestimate the heat-related nature of deaths across Australia simply because we're not recording them. What we measure really matters, and coronavirus has shown us that. We've seen from the pandemic that we can have very rapid emission reductions. So across the globe, our emissions have reduced very significantly. On average, across this year, they're probably going to be down 4 to 8% from where they would otherwise have been. And that 4 to 8% is actually pretty much aligned with our Paris Agreement temperature targets. If we keep on reducing our emissions by about 7% year on year, we will actually head towards a temperature target, a net zero sort of achievement in terms of emissions, which leads to temperature achievement of something in the region of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. The trouble with this is that the COVID policies, the lockdown policies, were not designed with the intention of cost-effective and efficient ways of reducing our emissions. So we've had that emission reduction, but at huge pain, economically, personally, in terms of our mental health, etc., to get that gain. And so that plays into some of the arguments that, reducing emissions is problematic in terms of our economy, it's going to cost us dearly. But that flies in the face of our understanding of that we do have an understanding that we can reduce emissions and generate many, many co-benefits in very sensible ways. So we can do things such as achieve those emission reductions, which we've shown we can do under coronavirus, but with no or little economic and other cost. So there are pathways through, and coronavirus has started to shine a light on what we can actually do in this space. We've also found from coronavirus that inequality matters and matters intensely. So initially, one of the framings of the coronavirus was it was called the Great Leveller, that it could affect everyone from prime ministers, everyone through society. So everyone could be affected. And that was the idea with this as a great leveller, so that it just didn't distinguish between the rich and the poor, etc. But what's actually happened and become very apparent is that coronavirus disproportionately affects women, disproportionately affects the poor, and disproportionately affects disadvantaged racial groups. And this is exactly the same as climate change. So we can translate some of those learnings we've had from coronavirus and the social implications, including the protests, which have been in part fed by disadvantage associated with coronavirus. And we can translate some of that learning to climate change, I would argue. We've also found through the coronavirus experience that denial really matters. And even though there is no specific significant constituency for coronavirus, so a lobby group rooting for coronavirus to block and misinform decisions on coronavirus, nevertheless, there have been general constituencies which have done that. And these are a couple of pictures down here. Honk if you question coronavirus. I don't know how you actually question a virus, but you know, as an example of that. And we saw at political and other levels, skepticism and denial associated with coronavirus, which downplayed the disease, its severity, its rapidity of expansion. And there's a quote from John Keane from Sydney University down the bottom, which I should read. I think it's a classic one. Dogged in their stupidity, thinking only of themselves, exaggeration, whose falsity will soon be exposed. And I dare anyone to actually say that if you put that up in front of someone and said, choose whether this applies to climate change or coronavirus, that they could actually differentiate. The same set of ideas, the same modus operandi that holds back our decision-making, holds back action on climate change, is exactly the same logic that's being used to hold back action on coronavirus. And the consequences of that are very clear because the cycle time is more rapid for coronavirus. And we've found to our cost that ignoring expert guidance is not a good idea. And we have found that it does not matter whether you believe that coronavirus is dangerous or not, it can still infect you and you can still die from it. And exactly the same applies to climate change. We've seen the potential for interactions between coronavirus and climate change drivers, such as greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen the issues about cascading, compounding, aggregating risks come to play when we've got things like Cyclone Amphan in the Bay of Bengal, and how that interacted with coronavirus. So during the evacuation and the rescuers, the people who are there to help, there was a spike in terms of infections because of close proximity and because of the nature of the evacuation. We've got big concerns in some parts of our society about the Black Lives Matter protests and the implications of that for coronavirus. And whilst, of course, these are playing out in different timescales from climate change, what they demonstrate is that it's not just climate change by itself, it's climate change interacting with all of these other things, just like it wasn't coronavirus by itself, it was coronavirus interacting with other things. And the last couple of slides is just about where we go from here. It's the longer term response. I think, again, what we've learned from coronavirus is the importance of integrated responses. that we need to have an economic response and an employment response and a mental health response and an environmental response, etc. We've also learnt that the best way forward is through shared responsibilities, because it's not either individual action or governmental action that generates the good outcomes. It's both together, working together. So that's one of the things we've learned, and exactly the same applies to climate change, I would argue, that we need both individual responses and we need good policy responses as well. And looking at coronavirus, we do have choices to be made that will influence the trajectory of climate change over the next decades and centuries. We can go down the argument about snap back, bounce back, back to normal, which is all sort of going back to the way things were, or we can change our thinking and we can bounce forward in a positive way. We can rethink and redirect. We don't have to go back to the way things were. And this is a really important point in time where we can move into a different trajectory from the one we were on into one which we actually think collectively as a nation that we should be on, because 90% of Australians want more action on climate change. This is potentially a huge vote winner. The logic of not taking advantage of this and moving forward in a positive way defeats me. Is it the end of ideology? Doubtful, at least from my perspective. I think in some ways it's actually reinforced some ideologies, and we've seen that coming out in various political statements and activities over the last few weeks, and a couple of those are put up here on the slides. So some groups have already started to plot out what different coronavirus recovery options might mean in terms of climate change. So this is work that came out from Oxford University, but other groups, including a group at ANU, are working on this, and they ranked a whole series of different options in terms of the long run economic multiplier, of $1 spent now, how much will it actually deliver benefit in the future, and in terms of potential climate change impact, so low emissions and low exposure to future climate change. And they did this through an expert survey across a very large number of people, across a very diverse array of people, and they plotted out these different options, and you can see those, the little bubbles on the diagram. And I don't want to go into the detail, but you can look the reference up yourself if you want the detail. But the key thing that they came up with, there was a whole series of policies which had very strong potential in terms of their economic multipliers, so they were good investments, and also delivered on climate change action, both mitigation, reducing emissions, and adaptation. And the broad sort of coverage of this is policies which emphasize clean infrastructure, that emphasize building efficiency retrofits, so energy efficiencies, that emphasize investment in education and training, that emphasize natural capital investment, and that emphasize clean R&D are all positive. And in some countries, rural support and rural development can also be part of this picture. And I would argue that in Australia, we're probably one of those countries because of the significance of our agriculture sector. So this just brings me to the end of my slides, but just to recap, what I've tried to do here, without being exhaustive, is just to start to tease out some of the things that we can learn from the coronavirus experience that will have currency in terms of changing the debate and changing the action we take in relation to climate change, and put us on a much better trajectory than the one we were on before the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we're just about to open the floor for audience questions. And just a reminder to everybody to please put any questions you have in the Q&A section and not in the chat. And that you can also vote on questions by putting a thumbs up against the ones that you'd like answered. I've just got a quick question for you just while people are doing that, which is obviously there being massive amount of direct disruption due to COVID-19. And one implication is that the UN climate talks, COP26, have been postponed by a year due to COVID. What do you think the implications of this are, and are there any opportunities as well as challenges?
Yeah, Um, can you just repeat that? Because I was actually just trying to navigate into chat and seeing the questions coming up. So
okay, so the UN climate talks COP26 have been postponed, which were due to happen in Glasgow and this year in November, have been postponed by a year. So what are the implications, and do you think there are opportunities as well as challenges due to this?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Look, perfectly understandable. There's a postponement, but unfortunate, because the Glasgow discussions were really crucial in terms of ramping up the ambition of different countries. So becoming more ambitious in terms of their emission reduction targets, and also more ambitious in terms of the other aspects of the Paris Agreement, which includes adaptation and finance and various other things. And in particular, this was an agenda which was strongly supported within the UK, who had a very strong bipartisan approach to this. And whilst it is planned to continue to be over in Glasgow a year later, is that the political dynamic will inevitably change because of coronavirus. And so there will have been both losses and gains of political capital in this process, and a different economic position that people will be, the countries will be in post-coronavirus, and hence that may influence their preparedness to invest and preparedness to engage in, I guess, the more adventurous policy options.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tom Worthington. Why are politicians so ready to accept scientific evidence for COVID-19 but not climate change? Can we learn how to adjust our message?
I think that was what I was trying to pull out in my talk, is that there's a couple of things here. One is the narrative about short versus long term. Coronavirus is short, climate change is long, deal with the short. Another one is cost. Climate change just simply costs too much, so we don't deal with it. Another one, of course, is constituencies and lobbying of those constituencies. So where you've got particular industries who are lobbying strongly to the government, we don't necessarily have an alternative constituency which is as strong as the industry constituencies, and so we get a decision making which leans one way. Whereas in contrast with coronavirus, there, as I tried to explain, there is no constituency for the coronavirus. And that tends to make a less muddy decision-making political environment. And the list could go on. But I think what we need to learn from this is how to reframe our arguments so that they are consistent with the red button issues that politicians responded to, that allowed them to make more adventurous decisions in relation to climate change.
Thank you. And we will actually be talking more about communicating on our webinar on the 9th of July. So if you're interested in the issues of communication around climate change, then that would be worth attending. We'll talk about that at the end. Next question. The key issue, which is sort of related actually, the key issue is the time lag between COVID and climate change. How do we change the public political perspective on this? Much better media coverage. That's sort of covering. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that?
Oh, again, it's really ramping up that dialogue that climate change is a near and present danger for a country like Australia, that there are many costs associated with climate change which were already accruing, which are impacting on individuals, they're impacting on government, they're impacting on our environment and our economy, and yet we don't seem to be taking full recognition of the linkage between these particular events and damages and climate change. And so we need to be communicating very consistently about the nature of those linkages.
Thank you. And next question by Anonymous. It seems like the gas lobby is really moving in, as you say, but they're brainwashing the public that it's a good move. Should scientists be more active in making sure that brainwashing doesn't happen? If so, how do we do it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. When we actually look at the analysis of gas, particularly gas as an electricity source, is that gas is often portrayed as a clean fuel, but when you include all of the life cycle emissions associated with the extraction and transport, across large distances, transport across small distances, so leaky gas pipes, and at the point of use. And given that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, we actually find that gas is not that clean at all. So being very clear that gas is cleaner than coal, but it's actually nothing like a clean source of energy. So that's the first point. Secondly is that gas is extraordinarily expensive. And so if we're looking towards gas used domestically for electricity, that's a pathway to expensive energy. And if you look at the trajectories of gas price in Australia domestically versus internationally, there's a huge divergence there, and we need to be asking why and how we can fix that. Lastly is that there's examples, including in South Australia, where it's very clear that gas, rather than being a transitional bridging fuel, will actually be left behind by the rate of change into renewables. And the projections for gas as a proportion of South Australia's energy supply coming at the end of this decade is it's going to be single digits. And so the whole idea that we're dependent on gas can actually be torn apart and framed in its small chunks, but also in that bigger picture, which is we don't have to have gas as a bridging fuel.
Thank you. Next question from Jenny Goldie. To what extent will COVID-19 restrict the necessary action on climate action? There are opportunities, of course, but will the ongoing restrictions on people's movement until a vaccine is developed impede action on climate change?
Interesting is that I think there's positives and negatives. So obviously limiting air travel does have an impact. So air travel is about 2% of our global emissions, and that's down well over 50% at the moment. And so that will have a small implication for future change. I think what we're seeing is broadly a very positive sort of implication for climate change through restrictions in mobility, simply because we're doing things like this, having virtual conferences. We're finding smart ways of interacting without actually moving ourselves physically, and the footprint associated with that. In terms of the international negotiations, I've already mentioned that I think it's unfortunate that the COP26 has been postponed because it was such an important COP, and because we've got so little time to act if we're to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, the lower temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. And so there's positives and negatives associated with what's going on and the changes we're seeing in terms of mobility of people across different borders. One slight addition to that is that because of the pandemic and the shutdown of immigration, we'll actually see a much reduced immigration intake in Australia this year, which will have quite significant economic implications, because we've been very dependent on population growth to fire up our GDP growth in Australia. But that will also, of course, have implications in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. So those emissions and the emission growth associated with that immigration will at least be delayed until that starts to build up again, assuming previous policies apply.
Thank you, Mark. So another question, how do you assess the government's technology roadmap in view of climate action needs?
Look, I think it's really positive that we've got a broad scale assessment of the different technologies that we can apply that take us forward in terms of economic development, energy based industries and environmental achievements. The challenge for me is that it is not just about the technology. We have to put in place elements of policy of different types. We need to apply that to the social environment. We need to understand the implications of these technologies in terms of environmental issues, and we need to understand them in terms of human decision making, in relation to jobs, in terms of places where people are going to live, in terms of investments that individuals and companies will make. So for me, it's a step, but it's only one step amongst what should be a much more systemic approach And at the moment, I don't see that systemic approach.
Yeah. And a question from Jane Suttle. Can you suggest where we individuals should put our energy in future? And I think she means in terms of climate action. After 20 years of petitioning, emailing, marching, voting, letter writing, it's hard to know how to make our concerns heard.
Yeah, it's one of the really big questions about how do you change things, and one obvious answer is vote. So when you're voting at the next election and elections, think carefully about where you put that vote, and listen to the plans and their realism in terms of the different candidates. There's, I think, still opportunity to sway some of the people who are sort of, in a sense, very skeptical of climate change. But that's often a hard task because it's not necessarily a rational argument you can have there. These things are, have lots of different components, emotional components. It's not to say there's rights and wrongs here, but it's a difficult conversation in many cases. There are, however, some people who are ambivalent or who are just not really engaged in the topic, and engaging with those people and showing them that there are ways that we can make a difference, both personally and at the policy level by doing things differently, I think is a way forward. And so I think every one of us can have leadership in this domain, and every one of us has a story to tell.
Yeah, and I think you've just answered the next question, which is about what are the most effective ways to get results without government. Apart from at an individual level, would you say anything about sort of how people, other forms of action? Because you've covered what we can do individually, perhaps in the corporate domain. What's happening?
Well, it's a slightly different answer to that is that I think there's a real danger of pushing down the responsibility for these sorts of issues, both coronavirus and climate change, onto the individuals, so that it's all about individual action. Sure, washing hands, social distance, all the rest of it's important there, but it's not just about that. We needed to have the supporting policy environment, the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, etc., policies that allowed people to do that. So we need to have the enabling environment from policies, but we also need to have the individual behaviours. And in climate change, however, what we tend to do is we're just pushing down on the individual. So it's the individual who needs to reduce their car use, eat less meat, don't fly on holidays, heat your house less than you would otherwise do, etc. And so all of that pushes down on individuals, and that individual action, whilst it's important and it may make some of us feel good and some of us feel not so good, is not enough to deliver us the climate change goals that we signed up to in the Paris Agreement. And so there's a real risk of individualizing action on climate change rather than having both a combined individual and collective activity. And that collective activity can be community groups buying up batteries or investing in solar panels. But importantly, it actually is involving government policies which actually help people make better decisions.
Thank you, Mark. And we've got some, unfortunately, we sort of run out of time. We've got a lot more questions there, but I think we're just going to have to close up. I just wanted to say to you, we've got 3 more events in this series of events on COVID-19 and climate change. So on the 25th of June, Professor Warwick McKibben and Sharon Friel will be discussing policy responses. On the 9th of July, Dr. Will Grant and Dr. David Holmes will be discussing communications around climate change and COVID-19. And then on 23rd of July, Dr. Aparna Lal and Anna Greta Hunter will be discussing health implications. So more details on our website, and we hope to see you there. We'll also be sending out a short questionnaire to get your feedback and a link to this because the event has been recorded. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Mark. That was a really interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you to everybody for your questions, to all of your audience, and we hope that you enjoyed the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone.